Awesome. Well, thanks to all of you for taking the time to join this little talk. The future of UX, evolving roles and skills. So I have a couple of topics I'm going to touch on. The first is going to be entitled, let's see here, Getting a Seat at the Table. What is the table before we go into getting a seat at the table? I'm looking at the quote here. I define the decision-making table as the place where the most trusted and capable employees, volunteers, and consultants are invited to offer their input in helping the organization's leaders make important decisions. So I see at that table, there's nobody sitting there. It's a cool picture. They left their computers and it looks like they didn't leave any power supply. So I think those computers will be running out of battery soon. So that's not really important. So just as the quote states, this is where conversations happen and choices are made. And more importantly, for the conversation around UX, decisions around which vendor to go with or platform to build on, early brainstorming and solutioning can also happen at these types of meetings. So why do you want a seat at the table, or why do you want to be in these meetings? For many reasons, but the one I want to focus on here is so that you and your team doesn't get stuck with some compromised platform or vendor or software that isn't really user-friendly and worse, isn't really UX-friendly. And then your team is sort of on the hook to design some best-in-class experience within this platform or product, right? So I've got this next slide here. Oops. User-centered design is an iterative design process in which designers focus on the users and their needs in each phase of the design process. So the early phase of the design process is making these choices. It is selecting oftentimes a vendor or a platform or some software. You really don't want to leave that up to your colleagues to sort of wear that UX lens in these big decision-making meetings. It's really not worth the risk, right? You want to set your team up for success out of the gate, and that often starts kind of in these initial conversations, right? A great example of this would be like enterprise software, right? Say your company is considering buying versus building something. You're coming to the table, the table, and you're wondering things like, and you're going to be having questions like, how flexible is the UI? Can they take on our design system? Is it responsive? How does it scale? These are the kinds of questions that a UX designer might ask, but others might not ask. So it's actually really a win-win to everybody if they could include, UX in these conversations. And then you won't be frustrated like this designer in this deck right here. So, how do you get invited, right? You can be really lucky and work for a company that's founded by designers. And by default, they would have the whole UX team at the table. And I live here in San Francisco. There are several companies, really big companies, Airbnb and Uber, et cetera, where designers were very much part of the founding of the company. And so UX and stuff like that was sort of baked into the fabric early on. Or you can be like the rest of us, where you really have to evangelize the need for good UX sort of at every turn. And that's just, you got to stay alert. You got to be aware of where people, where people may not be as versed or understand exactly what goes on in the world of UX. So, it's just really being able to share and explain sort of what you do and how you help products and how you solve problems and create value, et cetera. So you're already recognized as a good designer in a lot of cases. What I recommend, and this is kind of back to the conversation of really how to get a seat at the table and at this table where these big decisions are made, I recommend becoming more conversationally versed. That's sort of a bigger term that basically means, learn some of the lingo around some of the neighboring roles and disciplines to UX, right? So get involved with testing and research, help write discussion guides for user interviews, collaborate on surveys or tree tests. Oftentimes, things like this can be as easy as just asking for an invite to another working session that's already going on that you may not have already been invited to, right? You work with a lot of subject matter experts that are just outside of UX. And if you can go out and just kind of make some connections and get involved, and like I said, get some invitations to some other working sessions, you will become more versed. And as you become more versed and more well-rounded as an employee, it's recognized. It's recognized in meetings by your peers, by management, et cetera, and all this sort of adds up. I have an example just within my own world here. I wanted to learn more about product management. Oh, let's look at the slide here. Gandhi, live as if you were to die tomorrow. That's kind of crazy. Learn as if you were to live forever. So in the learning camp, I think that's sort of why I had this slide. I wanted to learn more about product management and the tools that product managers use in their daily life of managing products. So I reached out to a colleague at my company, and I set up sort of like a tutorial exchange where I took an hour to show him sort of some ins and outs of Figma, how to export stuff, how to zoom in, zoom out, really basic Figma stuff. And in turn, he did sort of a deep dive with me into Jira, helped explain our company's tech stack and how some of the architecture worked. So I became super versed, or at least more versed, into that whole world where I had a little bit of understanding. You can also take classes, you can attend webinars, you can go to conferences like Standouts. Standouts is a community of accomplished individuals where people share stories, ideas, and trends for the ever-growing digital ecosystem. Little shameless promotion. But the idea is fundamentally that the more knowledgeable you become, the more opportunity that you will have to be included, right? And don't forget, part of the job of being a director or a vice president or an executive is to really surround yourself with smart people. And so as you become smarter or recognized as a more well-rounded, smarter person in your business, it's just going to happen. You'll start to see that you're going to be invited to these conversations, and you'll be able to chime in and sort of voice your feelings and your approach to solutions. And ultimately, like I said earlier, you're setting your team up for success because you're gonna green light the products, and you're gonna green light the platforms and the services that play well with UX, and that you're gonna be able to curate good experiences within. That makes sense, yeah. So I'm gonna move on to the next topic. The next topic here is think outside of the laptop. This topic actually really isn't about the inside or the outside of a laptop. It's really about inspiration. And for those of you that have attended any of my other talks, you may have heard some of this stuff before, but I'm going to go into a little more detail, and I'm going to drill into a little more of just the inspiration aspect of this whole sort of chapter. So inspiration, this is sort of an overarching quote that I got from Bogdan Sandu from the Designer Daily. Inspiration gives us the energy to create new designs and to work hard to ensure they fit with our image or vision. It is when we are inspired that we produce our best work. Inspiration assists us with brainstorming, mapping out new ideas, with bringing these new ideas to life. So that's just a general sort of inspiration quote. Inspiration has always been a really important part of design, I think, way before computers. I think we all are aware of that. Here's a little inspiration slide. Here's an inspiration slide that drills in more to kind of UX primarily and some of the design process. So the inspiration phase, we're talking about it now as a phase within a whole kind of design process, is potentially the most important part of the design thinking process, as it lays the foundation for the next two steps to come. The quality of work in the inspiration phase feeds the raw material to work with in the ideation phase. Therefore, if garbage in, then garbage out. This is a quote from Nima Torabi, and this was in a Medium article that was just talking about design thinking in general. And you can see right here in the slide, inspiration is at the very top. when people talk about UX, it's often in relation to digital products, mobile apps, kiosks, websites, etc. And I feel like there's great value in widening your lens when it comes to thinking about what is UX, right? And I think people that are solving countrywide health issues in Cambodia, right here, how turning a chunk of unappetizing metal into a lucky iron fish addressed an anemia epidemic in Cambodia. That was from Margaret Rhodes' article in Fast Company. Or people that are designing MRI machines that are less scary to children. This is a story I read by David Kelly, who's one of the founders of IDEO. And this is him talking about it, I think a doctor named Doug. Doug's story illustrates the way that human-centered design can lead to breakthrough innovations. If we look further here in my deck, selecting the proper lighting for the produce section of a supermarket. This wasn't really a UX story. This is just something I thought about. But while these job titles may not be UX designer and are more likely to be something like architect or visual merchandiser, they are still solving problems and they are creating value. And if you look at this, they're leveraging a lot of the same disciplines and methodologies that we leverage in UX, right? They have a strategic brainstorm. They go through a discovery phase or sort of a build empathy phase, right? They diverge and go wide on lots of potential ideas or lots of potential solutions. Then they start to converge and narrow in on what's seeming to test well or perform well. And what does this sound like? This sounds a lot like the design process, right? Ultimately landing on a validated solution. So if we look back here, this didn't start out as a fish-shaped piece of iron. This started out as a big square chunk, but that wasn't solving the problem. So through testing and through research, they ended up on this, a validated solution. Similarly, this probably wasn't what the friendly MRI machine looked like in the beginning, but this is what it ended up with through testing and research and getting your designs validated. Same here. You're looking at fruit in a produce section being well lit. This is a validated solution. This wasn't just the designer coming in and saying, oh, I love yellow light. I love blue light. Let's do that based on my emotion. Let's actually use lean on the user and end up with a direction that actually works for them and that is validated, right? So I'll end this sort of section here, going back to that first slide. So I say, if we can collectively look at what UX is with that wider lens, I feel like our channels of inspiration will become that much more faceted and that much more dimensional, right? Looking back here at the quote at the top, and I've sort of made it a little larger font, it is when we are inspired that we produce our best work. And that's all we're asking, is for you to produce your best work. So get inspired, think outside of the laptop, look around you. There's all kinds of inspiration happening. There's all kinds of problem solving and people creating value in areas that aren't just a commerce flow or an insurance quote app. And that's sort of the whole point of this section here around thinking outside of the laptop. All right. Let's move on to the third and final section of this talk here. I was chatting with my boss last night and telling him that I was getting ready to come in and share around UX and where things are going in the future and evolving roles and skills, et cetera. And I said, hey, what should I talk about here? And he said, stop making new apps. Tell everybody to stop making new apps. And I was like, well, I don't think I'm going to be talking to everybody, but I'll tell the people that I'm talking to stop making new apps. And I was like, well, what exactly do you mean? He said, well, people aren't downloading apps anymore. People aren't waiting for that kid in the MIT dorm room to make this shiny new product. What people really want is for their current portfolio of apps to work smarter, for them to integrate, for them to collaborate, to talk to one another, to share data, to sort of meet the user where they are. That's my favorite quote of the week, meet the user where they are. I keep saying it. And if we look back at the evolution of digital product integration, products learning to talk to one another and integrate and collaborate, and we look back at some of the ancestors here, I start with Adobe. And I'll read a little quote here from their website. The programs included in the Creative Cloud. I still thought it was the Creative Suite, which, by the way, I learned it hasn't been called the Creative Suite since 2012. So that's about 10 years ago. The programs included in the Creative Cloud can be used in a wide array of graphic and design applications, from creating flyers to brochures to full motion videos, websites, presentations, photography, retouching, and more. So I'm bringing in a couple of these sort of, like I said, ancestors to digital product integration, because they definitely evolved, right? And I think the part that a lot of the evolution took place within was this area around collaboration, sharing data, integration, et cetera. And it's not just about sort of the back end. It's also on the front end. They often end up sharing a lot of UI patterns, iconography, tool palettes, voice and tone, et cetera, right? So if we look at Adobe here, we see InDesign is for layout. We see Photoshop is for pixels. We see Illustrator is for vectors. All of the different tools have a primary function, right? And that's pretty clearly delineated. Now, when it comes to more of the look and feel, et cetera, in the Adobe suite, you'll recognize that the tool palettes feel really familiar as you're going from product to product. The UIs are feeling really familiar. They share a lot of the same file formats, et cetera. Now, believe it or not, there was a time when it was sort of a hack to open an Illustrator file in Photoshop. I know that sounds super weird. Like, why would Adobe make two products and they didn't totally play well together? It just wasn't thought through, or it wasn't thought about at that time that was a user need. And maybe it wasn't a prime user need at the time, but it certainly became one over time, right? So nowadays you can certainly open, place, use files all over the place within these products. You can open an Illustrator file in Photoshop. You can place a photo in an InDesign layout, et cetera. I know that sounds like a no-brainer, but there really was a time when it was sort of a hack, right? Now they market all of these products. I'm looking here at the slide: Photoshop, After Effects, Premiere, InDesign, et cetera. They market them as a collective. And it used to not be the case. Again, I'm thinking back to the day when I would literally go to software stores, and it was even before the Apple Store, and you would buy Photoshop in a box. You'd open up the box. I know I'm really dating myself now, but there would be floppy disks, maybe 6 of them, and you would install Photoshop onto your computer. And that was it. You just had Photoshop, right? So now that they've evolved and they've recognized the importance of being able to collaborate and integrate and share data, their products are marketed as a collective, right? And that implies that they sort of work or go together. And I think that's kind of where I'm going with that. Another ancestor or old kid on the block would be Microsoft 365. We've got powerful apps for productivity, connection, and security. Outlook for mail, Word for documents, Excel for spreadsheets. And again, the UIs feel familiar. The tool palettes feel familiar. They share data. They share file formats. And again, believe it or not, there was a time when you would receive an email in Outlook, and if there was a date or an event or something in the email, you had to manually enter that date into your calendar. I know that sounds weird, but the integration and the data sharing just wasn't there yet. And that stuff was added on because it was what the users wanted, and Microsoft listened. And in the above story, Adobe listened, right? So these weren't out of the gate. They were things that as the company evolved, they brought this integration in, right? So nowadays, you look at Microsoft 365, and again, it is marketed and sold as a collective. You see all these products working together, playing together, sharing a lot. And then if we look at the new kid on the block, Google, I think you sort of get the picture here. When Google got around to making apps, integration and data sharing was a must-have. They never started out where you bought a box and you had floppy disks. Like I said, new kid on the block, they recognized that this was table stakes. There was no Google apps that worked in silos. So now, when it comes to mobile apps, which is sort of the topic here of this section, stop making new apps. When it comes to mobile apps, we saw sort of a frenzy in the beginning, apps doing all sorts of things, and they were just flooding the market. And I feel like when I was talking to my boss, Jahan, he was saying, stop making new apps. Now that the dust is starting to settle, users are overwhelmed and they're really not looking for more apps. They're actually throwing away apps and getting rid of apps. And I think users are looking for things to become more simplified. And one way is to achieve this simplification is to, yes, again, integrate, collaborate, talk to one another, and share data, right? So if I look, I just did sort of a case study on myself, and I looked at, in my phone, at one genre of apps. And in this case, I was looking at health and fitness apps. And I have about 10 apps that fall into that category on my phone. And I started using them and seeing which ones I liked better and which ones did the thing better. And you can see here in the slide, there is a couple of them were for bike rides, that first one, and then that fifth one on the top line, the Cannondale, and I think Map My Ride. A couple for workouts, Bolt, Fit Him. I don't know what the other one was named, something workouts. Some were for calorie counting, some were for steps, but there was redundancy. I had apps that were doing the same thing as other apps, right? And I thought, no question, the winner is going to be the one that does it and looks the coolest, that has the coolest font, that has the coolest, thin, sharp icons, whatever. And actually, it was quite the opposite. As I started to look at these apps, the integration piece was the part that really that stood out for me. It was this guy here. It's called Daily Workouts. It's got the ugliest UI on the planet. But if I look here at the next slide, I've filled in here now. You can see the primary focus of these apps, right? Bike rides, workouts, weight, calorie counting, marking my steps or capturing my steps, etc. While that might have been the primary focus, a handful of these guys, these 5 here that have the list below them, integrated with one another, right? So now my calorie counting app knows when I rode my bike. My health app knows when I stood on my scale. That became so much cooler and so much more of a needed and appreciated function for me than how cool they looked. So like I said, this Daily Workouts app, the UI is horrible and ugly and the fonts are gross and it almost might be Comic Sans, but it integrated where this workouts app and this workouts app didn't, and this of course was at the time I was doing this sort of little case study. They may have figured that out by now or maybe will in the future. But the idea here is that these all integrated and fun fact, they're not all made by the same company. In fact, I think 2 of these are made by the same company. I think this calorie counter app, MyFitnessPal, and the bike ride app, Map My Ride, are both by Under Armour. But Renpho, Daily Workouts, Health, these are not made by Under Armour. And they all play together. So guess what happens next? Boom. Bye-bye. 5 apps gone in the garbage. So that was really, Jahan, my boss, saying, hey, stop making new apps, led me to go look at this sort of like the ancestors, the Adobe, the Microsoft, the Google, of how they've done product integration and how that's really, sort of evolved from where they started and how that was something that users wanted and has become a real sort of table stakes now, or a must-have in looking at some of the newcomers to that, those suites of products. And now, it's helping really clean up that landscape and recognize really the term here is evolve or dissolve, right? So you just saw these products here were able to evolve and sort of speak to one another, and I'm going to dissolve the other parts, right? Where the shiny penny is always awesome. We may not want to always be looking for that shiny penny and creating that new app, and really kind of think about how we can make what we have, optimize what we have, make it work smarter for us, make these products talk to one another, share data, et cetera. And I think that will help us clean up our landscape. And we can go from 10 apps to 5, which you just saw here in my little presentation. Now, this actually all goes back to the first conversation around getting a seat at the table, right? So being part of vendor selection or platform selection at that very beginning will make sure that you set up your team with a product that can scale and that can integrate and share data, right? So if it's your job to put together a landscape or a whole portfolio of tools, being part of that vendor selection or that software selection early on will mean that you're looking at a tool or a solution that scales well and can play with your whole sort of suite that you're tasked with putting together. Thus solidifying the ability to have your products share data, talk to one another, and give that user that optimized experience across all of it, right? So yeah, a lot of stuff. It was cool that I was able to sort of tie back to that first topic around getting a seat at the table by way of, stop making apps, make the ones we have work smarter for us. Thank you guys for being part of this talk.